When you are coding your transactions, it's really important to use the correct chart of account code, as this affects your GST returns and your reports. Making mistakes can be really costly, so you need to learn what codes you should and shouldn't use. The account codes in Xero's chart of accounts have pretty good descriptions on how the code should be used. For example, Travel International, expenses incurred from international travel which has a business purpose. That is pretty self-explanatory. So if in doubt how to use a code, the first place to look is here at the description. However, there are some codes that sound similar or their names are a bit deceptive, but you really don't want to get them confused. The best way to avoid that is to remember a list of codes not to code to. These include general expenses. A tendency is to use this code when people aren't sure how to code expenses. The general expenses code is for a more specific purpose, despite its name, and you should check with your accountant or bookkeeper what to use it for. You don't want the majority of your expenses in this code, as you won't get an accurate picture of your business overheads. Office expenses. Just like the general expenses code, there is a tendency to put all expenses to do with the office in this code, whereas there are other codes to use, such as printing and stationery, cleaning, light power heating, that you should use instead. Depreciation. This is for your accountant or bookkeeper to use to calculate depreciation for a given period. If you buy an asset such as a computer or office furniture, you would use the 720 computer equipment or 710 office equipment codes, not the depreciation code. So if you are buying something of high value that has a long-term benefit for the business, it will need to be put to an asset code, not an expense code. If that asset is not computer equipment or office equipment, new codes will need to be added. Again, you need to double check the rules for assets with your bookkeeper or accountant because they have changed recently with COVID-19 and other IRD updates. In general, you shouldn't be coding expenses to balance sheet codes unless they are assets or prepayments, which is when you pay for something you haven't received a tax invoice for yet. We're going to look at reconciling prepayments in the 201 course. So the easiest thing to remember is not to code things to balance sheet codes. And here are some coding reminders for certain situations. If you have expenses that are not business-related costs, they are considered personal expenses and should be coded to drawings. If you've paid yourself out from the business and aren't on payroll, put that payment to drawings. If you put your own money into the business for whatever reason, put that to funds introduced. Not all your suppliers or business expenses will have GST on them, so double check if they do by looking at receipts and invoices carefully. You can't claim GST if the supplier isn't GST registered, so you'll need to either have a separate code set up with no GST for these expenses, or manually change the GST on individual transactions if the code has GST, which we will look more closely at in the 201 course. A common coding mistake is to use expense codes in sales invoices, which is not correct. You should always use revenue codes, i.e. sales codes, in sales invoices. For example, if you are charging for labour costs in your invoice, do not use a subcontractor's or labour expense code for this line item. Instead, you should set up a new sales code called sales labour. Otherwise, your income will be underreported and the true revenue will not be reflected. This also applies when you are on-charging materials or services to customers or clients with a markup. Again, you should not use an expense code in the sales invoice. You should make a new sales code for this. For example, if you were on-charging freight delivery costs, you would not use the freight and courier code. You would instead set up a new sales code called Sales Freight. If you have received a refund for an expense, you code the refund to the same chart of account code as the expense. For example, if you bought some stationery that you later returned and was refunded for, you would code that refund to 461 printing and stationery, as that is what you would have coded the original expense to. Again, if in doubt, seek advice from your bookkeeper or accountant or get in touch. It will cost you a lot more in the end if you keep coding things incorrectly, because your accountant or bookkeeper will have to spend a lot of time correcting your coding. Now let's test your knowledge with a quick quiz.